welcome back to Compact Conflict TVs. Here's part 2 of our Fort Donelson series. Audio for the camp and the surrender house did have to be re-recorded due to a leaf blower and a weed eater going off due to the Park Service beautifying the parks.
All right, so what is this hut right next to us?
Yes, there were 400 of these huts that were inside of the fort itself. And remember, the actual fort itself encompassed about 12 acres. In these huts, the soldiers were in winter quarters then, which is very few times during the war was the campaign going on in the winter. But this was one of the times here. The huts were built and so the soldiers could have some protection from the elements. And each hut generally held about 4 men in each of the log huts.
Okay. I know by reading some southern accounts here, they were saying they were starving. Northern accounts were, oh my goodness, this is a bountiful harvest here. What was the food situation like, and what was a normal ration like for a soldier if they were trying to escape from here to Nashville?
Yeah, the normal daily ration during the Civil War for a soldier composed of 3 items. It was salted pork or salted beef, about 12 ounces of that. And by the way, a ration is what a soldier would eat per day, is what a ration was. And soldiers were given their rations every 3 days. It was called drawing your 3 days rations. You would get your salted pork, you would get your army bread, famously known as hardtack, and you were given 10 pieces of hardtack a day, so 30 for your 3 days rations. And the final part of the ration was the most important. That was the coffee ration. A lot of the veterans wouldn't even draw the meat or the bread, but you want your coffee ration because your coffee back then was almost as expensive as gold.
So at Donelson, was there an overabundance of food like the Northerners said, or was there just no food like the Southerners said?
The food was there. The problem was the logistics. The Confederates were not doing a good job of getting the food from the fort itself to the troops in the trenches. You got to remember, there was the fort, but of course there were over 2 miles of outer defenses there. That's where most of the Confederate Army was. I've never figured out why, but they never did get the rations from the fort properly to the men in the trenches. I don't know if there's a lapse of leadership, just ineptness. They claimed at the end, of course, the soldiers were hungry, but the leaders claimed that that's one of the reasons that they capitulated. But we know now it was not because of a lack of food. One of my favorite quotes, a Union officer said that there was so many slabs of bacon in there that they actually used the bacon to fill ditches where their wagons could go over. That's how much food was there. Now, the Union Army, however, that were enveloping the fort, they were hungry, and they admit that they only had a few crackers, pieces of hardtack, and while they were enveloping the fort.
So I guess both sides were learning how to soldier. One side doesn't know camp life, and I know, I think we mentioned it earlier, the Northerners done through their coats and everything as they're marching there because it was a little bit warmer, and they said, hey, it ain't getting cold in February and here in Tennessee, and just everybody's just learning how to soldier, I suppose.
Yes, they said we're in the sunny South now.
Oh, well.
That's what they thought. This is. They had no idea what was getting ready to happen. The next night.
But officers not learning how to enforce standards, NCOs, etc. Early on in the war, both sides are just learning some harsh lessons.
Yeah, later on in the war, if this battle had been fought later on in the war, a whole lot of things would have been totally different. Yeah,
I think the Southerners would have been able to hold out a little bit longer.
And they would have, exactly.
All right, so we're on the inside of the interior defenses right now. Can you explain why you would have an outer defense compared to an inner defense? How would that have helped the Confederates if the fort was to be attacked from our direction over here, which I don't know where that is?
Yes, I think it's
I think
that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's over there.
Yes.
The garrison, the fort here, it encompassed about 15 acres, okay? It was originally designed to hold the entire garrison, which I think they thought it was going to be 2,500 men. Well, it turned out after Fort Henry fell, this was going to be the main Confederate effort here.
They got some extra fellows over here trying to fit into their
Yes, between 15
bunk
and
hut.
17,000 men here. Okay, they're not going to fit here.
Correct.
Not only that, they knew we need outer defenses here to help fight off, because this is Dover is extremely hilly around here. It is perfect defensive position. They constructed a set of earthworks about 2 miles, encompassed about 2 miles of total length. That's where a majority of the Confederates were in the outer defenses of the earthworks.
Which we'll see a bit of it, but there's a lot of natural spurs here. I know our cameras aren't going to be able to get it because so much tree buildup, but there's a lot of natural spurs here where you've got spur, valley, spur again, just coming off of a central hill, essentially.
Oh yeah, perfect for defense.
Which is great for defense.
Yeah.
You can't frontal assault it.
Yep.
The other thing is, after the Union took this fort, did they hold on to it? Did they utilize it? Did this become central to Union strategy to hold on to at this point? Or how did the North use this land once they took it?
Now, the fort itself here, these 15 acres, we already mentioned there were about 400 huts down here. Disease had ravaged the Confederate garrison here. Smallpox, measles. The first thing the Union Army did when they occupied this was burn all 400 of the cabins. They did not use this fort here. This fort itself basically became obsolete. There was no danger from the Confederate Navy here. You know why?
I don't believe there was much of
They
one.
didn't have much of a Confederate Navy, yeah. Now, there was a Union garrison, roughly 600 men, that did stay here, at a fort here. It was built over here where the National Cemetery is now.
Okay.
Yeah, but this fort here was abandoned.
Just completely abandoned.
completely
Got
abandoned.
you. They mentioned disease here. What was the biggest killer in the Civil War? 'Cause I know it wasn't battles. Was it just disease from having everybody from all walks of life coming together, or what?
Absolutely. These young men, most of them from rural areas, from farms, had not been around large populations of people. When these people got together, they brought diseases with them. And the ones that had not been around them, they didn't have the immunities built up. And they were very, very susceptible to disease. Matter of fact, of the 620,000 soldiers that died in the Civil War, 2/3 of them died from disease. You know, today in our modern military, thank goodness, very few soldiers die of disease now, because inoculations.
Yeah, I was say, I know we inoculate, we do everything during basic training nowadays. Would disease have played a part in a decision-making part into surrendering this fort? Because you said there was an outbreak of either measles or smallpox.
Yes.
Did that happen as they're under siege?
Oh, before the battle.
Before the battle. So
soldiers were
before-
dying by the hundreds before the battle. Yes.
Would
Yeah.
that have played you think, a decision, or was it just inept leadership throughout?
At the very end, of course, some regiments were under strength, obviously, because of some of the sickness. However, at the end, it was just ineptness. They may want to blame it on sickness or so forth, but with the exception of maybe some under-strength regiments, still, they were fighting. They were still in fighting.
Morale and spirits are still high.
Morale was great. That's why they refer to it as a surrender most disgraceful. Yeah, morale was still sky high.
Which we'll talk about the politics and generalship at the surrender house here in a bit. But let's go over to Smith's Battery, or
Okay.
it's not Smith's Attack, sorry.
Yep.
So on the opposite side of the earthen fort, right here, you have, the woods are going to obscure it, but you have a spur coming up to still relatively hilly ground, coming right here, going up there. What's the point of making it all zigzag, having these, because these aren't rifle pits, right?
No, these are not rifle pits. These are earthworks.
These are, so this right here would have been not a moat, but just where the dirt was taken
Yeah,
from.
well, they took it up to make the actual hills behind us.
Mhm.
Right.
And then, do they have cannons on each of these points right here, or how do they place their cannons, and what's going on there? Why is it all zigzaggy?
Well, it's zigzaggy because you can get a field of fire when you're returning fire. Vauban was the man that invented the concept of the star forts, which were zigzag shaped.
Okay.
And that's what this is taking the Now, modern day, you would have zigzag. I guess back if an artillery shell hits right here, it's not going to kill everybody on the trench.
Correct.
Yeah, with the zigzag pattern too. Yeah, same thing back then. You asked another question too. Another great question.
Oh, where do they play? How do they determine the
Artillery.
placement of the cannon?
Yes, they tended to stay in batteries. We're going to see that at the outer defenses. They didn't like disperse one gun on this hill, one here. They worked better as a battery because it was better to get ammunition up to the guns itself.
Literally, the concept of teamwork makes that dream work.
Yeah.
And then if the Union were going to attack, they'd come up here, and then this, I guess, would act as another natural barrier almost, wouldn't it? Just like a side bonus benefit.
And something else that we didn't mention either. All of these trees here,
Would have been gone, yes.
it would have been gone. What the Confederates did, they cut these trees down and they would lay them down. And everybody pronounces this different, but an abattis is what that's called. And they would lay, it would be like a barrier that the Union Army, and this happened over at Smith's attack, they got caught up in that, trying to attack.
So as they felled the trees, it's not only to make their earthworks, it's to
for a defensive position.
just
also.
have little hideaway spots almost, to kind of think of it some cover.
To break up an attack. First off, it's hard to stay in uniform in a formation in an attack anyway. And then when you're coming up on all of this thick vegetation and sticks and trees and everything, you can't keep a proper order. And that was another reason for it.
Okay. Well, let's go over to Smith's attack.
All right. We are in front of Buckner's final defense now. When the Confederate Army opted for the breakout, a considerable portion of the entire garrison, about 8,000 of their infantry, had massed for the breakout. They're out of the trenches. When Grant saw that this was absolutely an attempt to break out the entire garrison, he knew, okay, they've been withdrawn. This is going to weaken them somewhere else. So he ordered Smith, who had already done an attack previously that had failed on the 13th, he ordered him to do an attack on the Confederate line. There was only one Confederate regiment that was holding the entire line here, the 30th Tennessee. He attacked, he was successful, he suffered pretty heavy casualties, several hundred casualties in assaulting their position, but he did crack the outer defenses of the Confederate earthworks. This was the only spot in the entire 2 miles of earthworks where the defenses were cracked, right here at Buckner's final defense. We were at the breakout site here. This was probably what it was, the bloodiest day of the entire battle here at Fort Donelson. After the gunboat battle and the freezing rain, the armies were pretty much decided they were just going to relax in the trenches and try to warm themselves up as much as possible. But the Confederates had another idea. The generals opted, we don't think we can hold the fort. We want to conduct a breakout. We want to break out our armies out and move our way out of this siege that they were in. Somebody could argue with me, that was a rash decision. Things were going perfect up to that point for them. They knocked all 4 gunboats out of action, both land battles. On the 13th they had won. That's what they opted to do. They moved a large portion of their army, about 8,000 of their infantry. They massed them down here to my right in an area called Barn Hollow. This was early in the morning. They tried to mass before dawn, but it was actually after sunrise when they finally were able to get in formation and attack. They attacked the Union regiments. Of course, that's going to be the Confederate left, the Union right. The Confederate regiments charged through these hills right here, through these woods, blew them off the ridge right here. Their goal was to hit Forge Road, which we'll get a picture of that before we leave. Forge Road is still there right down here. They blew open the breakout attempt, blew open the Union defenses here. It was wide open. The fighting went on for most of the morning. The Union Army, they were caught off guard. The Confederates then vacillated. One of the generals thought, we're going to break out and we're going to absolutely leave. We're going to bring our backpacks with us and 3 days cooked rations. But another general said, no, we're going to blow open blow open a hole in the Union lines. Then we're going to retreat back into the fort, grab our baggage, and then leave, which is an absurd notion right there. Okay. While that vacillation was going on, word got back to Grant of the breakout attempt. He rode up here, he saw that some of the Confederate dead had their backpacks with them. So he knew this is a breakout attempt. They're going to break out to try to absolutely leave. He ordered General Lew Wallace. Some of you may have heard of the great novel Ben-Hur. He penned that after the Civil War. Lew Wallace had his division. He marched them down the Winds Ferry Road here and was able to retake this ground. The Confederates retreated back into their trenches, and that night, the night of the 15th, the Confederate generals had a council of war in the Rice House back here. They opted to surrender the fort, and then of course the 16th is when they met at the surrender house, which we just came from, and they surrendered the fort and the garrison of Confederates. About 2,500 Confederates were able to get out. Nathan Bedford Forrest said, "I did not come here to surrender." He took his command, roughly 600 or 800 men. He said, "Anybody who wants to go with me can follow me." He even grabbed some infantrymen. They pulled them on the backs of their horses. They crossed the Lick Creek, which is right back here, and about 2,500 Confederates out of the garrison were able to escape through Lick Creek. But the remainder of the Confederates were surrendered and went to Union prison camps, mainly up at Camp Douglas in Chicago.
Alrighty.
We are at Manny's Battery right now, which is about roughly center of the Confederate outer defenses, which I mentioned earlier encompassed about 2 miles of total earthworks. Very, very dominating hill up here. On this hill, obviously, was Manny's Battery. It was a 4-gun battery of 6-pounders. On the 13th, they were shelling Union troops as Union troops were trying to take up position to envelop the fort. Union officer saw this up here, saw where the fire was coming from, and he ordered a general attack to stop this pesky battery. Well, if you remember, Grant had put out an order already, do not bring on an engagement. This is in violation of that. I guess he thought this was going to be an easy task. 3 regiments lined up. 1 came from my right, 2 from the left. This is not a good place to assault right here. It's uphill. All 3 of those regiments attacked. They were easily defeated. About 10 Confederate casualties, about 140 Union soldiers were killed or injured. One human interest side story here though. The woods caught on fire. We may have all heard about the incident at the Wilderness where that happened. It happened here too, and some of the wounded soldiers burned to death here when the woods caught on fire. There is a case of Confederates actually running out and grabbing 2 wounded soldiers that were about to be burned to death, Union soldiers grabbing them and pulling them in the lines with them to prevent them from burning to death. There's I'm not going to say a great, but there is an engraving, I've got it on my wall at home, of a Union soldier out here in front of Manny's Battery being enveloped in the flames. It's a very poignant engraving that was made, I believe in the 1870s. Somebody asked me too about the guns themselves. These were 6-pounders. They shot a 6-pound cannonball. Most of the rounds they were firing was the shell with the fuse in it, because they wanted the shell to go off up in the air to get maximum effect of spraying shrapnel down on the soldiers as they were advancing. These guns obviously took a lot of Union fire. And the problem with if you're an infantryman in these earthworks, it's not too bad. You may be showing the top of your head, but when you're a gunner out here, you are totally exposed. The battery here suffered so many casualties that by the end of the battle, only 1 gun was able to fire. That many people have been killed or injured. So a whole lot of fighting took place right here in this position. To my right is Indian Creek. On the top of Indian Creek on the other side is French's Battery. On our left is Graves Battery. So that should give you some references of where we are right now.
Okay, so we're here at the surrender house. Other than obviously the surrender, what happened here and what's the significance of this particular house or hotel as it was back then?
Okay, well, let's digress briefly back to the 15th, okay, when the breakout attempt, okay, total success, okay. The generals had not conferred before, and there was some confusion on what was supposed to happen here. One of the generals thought they were supposed to break out. The other one thought, no, we're not going to break out. We're going to come get our baggage and then break out. Okay. Both of them vacillated. The generals, the Confederate Army wound up retreating back into the trenches. When the generals met the night of the 15th, they opted on a surrender. A surrender most disgraceful, as it's described with the Confederate soldiers that were involved in it. The next morning, Buckner met. He was the only general left. The other two had jumped on transports and had abandoned them.
Floyd and Pellow had left,
they,
and I know all three generals were, as you said earlier when we were at the breakout, they just bickered.
Yes.
Bickered, couldn't come to a plan, nobody knew what, and they refused to talk to each other.
Criminal.
Yeah,
criminal. So Grant met at the Surrender House here, where we are. It was an inn back then, very popular inn in Dover. Buckner, Grant sat down. It's kind of funny, they knew each other back at West Point, and Grant had even borrowed some money from Buckner, and Grant offered the money back to him. And Simon was his first name. Simon said, no thanks, you don't have to pay me back right now. But then they got down to business, and that's when Buckner asked for terms. Grant said there are no terms except for unconditional surrender.
Then there was a fourth general here too, wasn't there? A Bushrod Taylor?
Bushrod Johnson.
Bushrod Johnson.
Right.
I always call him Taylor for some reason.
Yeah.
Is, from what my limited knowledge is of this, is I know Bushrod Johnson, after he was the other brigadier general here with Buckner. Buckner had more, seniority. He organized it, and I know the Northern Army, they weren't prepared for a mass surrender like this.
Correct. Yeah.
They didn't have, the infrastructure to make sure everything's going on, and that Buckner had told Bushrod Johnson to help organize the surrender. So he's out there barking orders, organizing. At the end, he just strolls off, winds up in Nashville, and fights at Chickamauga later in the war, if I'm not mistaken.
He walked right through the lines.
They just walked through the lines, and nobody stopped him because he'd been done giving orders the entire day.
Yeah, well, like you said, the Union Army all of a sudden had 12,000 prisoners to deal with, and they were not prepared for that. So.
And where did the enlisted man for those prisoners go?
They went to Camp Douglas, which is in Chicago.
What about, I'm assuming officers went to a separate camp than, the lowly soldiers did.
Yeah.
Where did everybody kind of spread out and go to?
Almost all the enlisted men went to Camp Douglas. And of course, they were paroled later on, which was early in the war.
Right.
This was. They would do that until some of these men were being captured 2 or 3 times and going back to fight.
And that is parole what parole means now? Is, hey, we're releasing you, promise not to do this again, have a great life. And then, as you just said, they're back here doing what they just promised to do. Is that, did parole mean the same thing back then? Okay.
Yeah. Or a prisoner swap, too. Yeah,
Okay.
because Confederates took prisoners also. Then as the war progressed, Lincoln realized, wait a second, these soldiers are coming back 2 or 3 times. So he put a stop to it. And that's when we started having the big problems at the prisoner war camps.
Okay.
Yeah. Andersonville for the Confederates, and then Camp Douglas, 80 Acres of Hell is what Camp Douglas was called. Yeah.
All righty. Thank you for your time, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any ideas on where we should do battle next, please consider joining our Patreon and follow us on our social media linked in this video. We look forward to your dispatches.